I want to make you a genuine promise. Not the kind that sounds good in a title and dissolves on contact with the actual content. A real one. The kind that Gabor Maté made. Implicitly, in every room he ever sat in every book he ever wrote, in every hour of clinical work he ever offered, to every person who came to him, carrying the specific weight of what the title of this video describes. The loneliness that has no adequate explanation. The depression that does not respond cleanly to the interventions that are supposed to address it. The lostness, that particular quality of moving through a life that looks functional from the outside while feeling from the inside like you are perpetually slightly off the path you were actually meant to be on, without being able to identify the point at which the divergence began. These are not separate conditions. They are not three different problems requiring three different solutions. They are, in almost every case Gabor Maté encountered across 50 years of clinical work, three expressions of the same underlying reality, the disconnection from the authentic self. And the promise I want to make you, the one that this conversation is actually capable of keeping, is this. In the next 15 minutes, I'm going to give you the clearest possible account of where that disconnection comes from, how it produces the specific suffering you've been carrying, and what the genuine path back to yourself actually looks like, not as a protocol or a program or a set of actionable steps that you implement and then evaluate for results, as an honest map of the territory, so that for perhaps the first time, the loneliness and the depression and the lostness make complete sense to you, not as random misfortune, as the entirely predictable consequence of something specific that happened to you and that can be understood, and that, when it is genuinely understood, begins to change. Understanding alone does not complete the healing. I want to be honest about that. The map is not the journey. But the person who has the map and knows where they actually are is in a fundamentally different position than the person who has been wandering in the same territory without one. And that difference between wandering and navigating is not a small thing. It is the difference between another 40 years of the same experience and the genuine beginning of something different. This is the beginning of something different. If you feel ready for that, if something in you has been waiting for exactly the quality of honest, clear, genuinely useful account of what has been happening and why, drop 11 in the comments right now. 11, the number of the person who is done wandering and ready to navigate. When you type 11, you are saying, I am ready to understand what has actually been going on, and to begin from that understanding, moving in a genuinely different direction. Type 11, and let us begin. Let me start with the loneliness, because it is almost always the first of the three experiences to arrive, and the one that most consistently underlies the other two. Gabor Maté made a distinction about loneliness that I have found nowhere else with the same precision. He distinguished between the loneliness of circumstance, the ordinary, understandable experience of being without adequate social connection, which responds to the addition of genuine social connection, and what he called the loneliness of disconnection from the self. The loneliness of disconnection from the self is different from ordinary loneliness in a specific and important way. It persists in the presence of other people. It is present in relationships. It is present in social situations. It is present, and this is the most disorienting quality of it, even in moments of genuine connection with people who genuinely care about you. It is the loneliness of someone who is in the room, but not quite fully there, who's present in body, but inhabiting a slight but persistent distance from the actual experience of being present, who has been relating to the world through the persona, through the adapted, managed, presented version of the self, for long enough that the experience of genuine contact, genuine being met, genuine mutual recognition has become something they are not sure they have ever fully had. Gabor Maté says, this loneliness is not the absence of people, it is the absence of yourself. The specific experience of a self that has been so consistently in the position of managing its presentation rather than simply being present. that it has lost, or perhaps never fully found, the experience of genuine interior company, of being genuinely at home in itself. And this loneliness, the loneliness of not being home in yourself, produces something specific. It produces the hunger, the persistent, low-grade, never quite satisfied hunger for something that the available sources of relief, the relationships, the achievements, the substances, the entertainment, the constant activity, never quite provide. Because what is hungry is not the thing those sources feed. What is hungry is the authentic self, and the authentic self cannot be fed by anything external. It can only be fed by genuine presence to itself. That hunger, chronic, largely unnamed, producing the constant background sense that something is missing, despite the presence of what should be enough, is the loneliness Gabor Maté spent his career pointing at. Not as a character flaw, as the entirely predictable consequence of a developmental process in which the authentic self was required to make significant compromises in order to maintain the connections it needed to survive. Now let me tell you about the depression, because once you understand the loneliness in the way I have just described it, the depression becomes legible in a way it almost never is in the standard clinical account. Gabor Maté was careful about the word depression. Not because he dismissed it as a real experience, it is completely real, and its suffering is completely genuine. But because he understood that the clinical framework of depression is primarily a biological disorder of brain chemistry, while not entirely wrong, was missing something essential, something that the biological account could not capture, and that the standard treatment approaches therefore could not address at the level where the depression was actually being generated. He said, depression, particularly the chronic, treatment-resistant, persistent variety that does not respond cleanly to medication or to cognitive approaches, is almost always, at its deepest level, the suppression of the authentic self's most essential needs and most genuine emotional experience, not as metaphor, as biology. Because the suppression of genuine emotional experience, the chronic, sustained, physiologically expensive work of managing what is actually present in favor of what is required by the persona, produces measurable changes in the neurological and hormonal systems that regulate mood. The chronic low-grade stress of inauthenticity, the depletion that comes from the ongoing metabolic expense of the gap between the genuine interior experience and the managed exterior presentation. The specific biological consequences of a nervous system that has been running the suppression program for so long, that the systems responsible for generating the experience of aliveness and meaning and genuine engagement with life have become dysregulated. Gabor Maté is not saying that depression is not real. He is saying it is more real than the standard account acknowledges, that it is not simply a chemical imbalance to be corrected, but the body's faithful biological expression of a life that is not being lived from its genuine center. And that the treatment approaches that address only the biology, while sometimes genuinely helpful in managing the intensity of the experience, are not reaching the level at which the depression is being generated. What reaches that level is the genuine return to the authentic self, the closing of the gap between the managed presentation and the genuine experience, the recovery of genuine access to the emotional life that was sealed, the needs that were suppressed, the authentic responses to experience that were converted into something more acceptable before being allowed expression, the genuine, slow, imperfect, enormously important process of becoming more honestly oneself. And that process, Gabor Maté documented this consistently, produces changes in the experience of depression that the biological approach alone cannot reliably produce. Not because psychology is more powerful than biology, because psychology and biology are not separate domains. Because the authentic self, returning to genuine presence, is itself a biological event with biological consequences in exactly the systems that generate the experience of aliveness and meaning and engagement. Now the lostness, The third experience, the one that is perhaps the most difficult to describe because it is the least dramatic in its surface presentation and the most pervasive in its actual impact on the experience of being alive. Gabor Maté understood lostness, the specific quality of moving through a life that looks adequate from the outside, while feeling from the inside like it has not quite found its real direction, as the natural consequence of a self that is organized around an externally derived rather than internally generated sense of purpose and direction. He said, the authentic self has a direction, not a destination in the sense of a specific achievement or a specific outcome, a direction, a felt sense of what is genuinely calling it, of what genuinely matters to it, of what it is here to contribute in the specific and personal and irreplaceable form that only it can contribute. And that direction is not available from outside. It is not discoverable through career aptitude tests or strategic life planning or the careful analysis of market opportunities. It is felt. It is bodily known. It is present in the genuine enthusiasms and the genuine responses to experience and the genuine longings of the authentic self when those things are allowed to surface without the immediate intervention of the persona's editing function. The person who is lost genuinely, persistently, in a way that does not respond to more goal setting or more strategic planning or more productivity optimization is almost always a person whose direction has been externally rather than internally determined for long enough that the internal compass has become difficult to read. Not because it has stopped working, but because the noise of the external determination, the requirements of the persona, the expectations of the environment, the accumulated weight of what has been decided is appropriate to want and appropriate to pursue, that noise has made the signal of the authentic direction difficult to hear. The path back from lostness is not the addition of more external direction. It is the recovery of the capacity to hear the internal one. And that recovery requires something specific. It requires the quieting of the noise that has been drowning the signal, the gradual removal of the layers of external determination that have been placed over the authentic direction, the patient, honest, often uncomfortable process of asking not what should I want, but what do I actually want? Not what is the right path, but what path feels genuinely mine. Not what will be approved of, but what is genuinely calling me. Those questions are simple to ask and genuinely difficult to answer, because the persona, the adapted self that has been organized around external approval and external direction, does not easily relinquish its authority over the direction of the life. It has very good reasons from its own perspective for maintaining that authority. The external direction was safe. It generated approval. It avoided the specific vulnerability of moving in a direction that was genuinely personal and therefore genuinely exposable to the specific risk that personal things carry, the risk of genuine investment in something that is genuinely yours and the genuine possibility that it will not be received or will not succeed. But Gabor Maté was clear about the cost of the alternative. The cost of the externally determined life, the specific, chronic, low-grade, but enormously expensive cost of moving through a life that is not genuinely yours, that is organized around external approval rather than internal direction, that is producing the lostness, not because you have failed to find the right external path, but because the right path is always for every human being an internal one, and you have been looking for it in the wrong direction. Now I want to give you the 7 things that Gabor Maté identified as the most important and most practical steps available on the genuine path back from the loneliness and the depression and the lostness, not as a protocol, as genuine navigational points, places where the path is most clearly visible and the direction is most honestly available. The first, begin to distinguish between the feeling and the story about the feeling. This is perhaps the most foundational practical skill available. Gabor Maté observed that most people in the suffering of the loneliness and the depression and the lostness are not actually in contact with the genuine feeling. They're in contact with the story about the feeling, the narrative the mind has constructed around what is present, which is almost always a narrative that moves away from the genuine experience and toward explanation, justification, comparison, or the performance of appropriate emotional response. The genuine feeling, the raw, pre-narrative, bodily felt experience of what is actually present is simpler than the story. And it is more directly informative. It is the authentic self speaking in the only language available to it when the verbal narrative has been organized around the persona's requirements rather than the genuine experience. Learning to distinguish between the two, to feel the feeling before constructing the story about it, is the beginning of the genuine return to the self. Because the feeling, when it is actually felt rather than immediately narrated, points directly at what is real, at what is needed, at what the authentic self is trying to communicate through the only channel that has not been fully colonized by the persona's management. The second, begin to notice what genuinely interests you rather than what you are supposed to be interested in. This sounds simple. It is not simple, because the persona's editing function operates so automatically and so efficiently that many people genuinely cannot initially distinguish between genuine interest and performed interest, between the enthusiasm that is actually theirs and the enthusiasm that has been adopted because it was appropriate or expected or generated approval. Gabor Maté says, genuine interest has a specific quality in the body, a warmth, a forward lean, a quality of aliveness that does not require effort to maintain and does not disappear when the external approval disappears. Performed interest is maintained by effort. It requires the ongoing work of the persona to sustain it, and it diminishes when the performance context is removed. Begin to notice the difference in the small things first, in what you actually want to read rather than what you feel you should be reading, in what you actually want to spend time on rather than what is on the approved list. These small noticings are the first navigational readings of the authentic compass. They are the internal signal beginning to become audible beneath the external noise. The third, begin to allow yourself to grieve what has not been available. The loneliness and the depression and the lostness almost always carry within them a grief that has not been allowed to complete. The grief for the genuine connection that was not consistently available. The grief for the authentic self that was required to compromise. The grief for the direction that was not followed. The grief for the version of the life that would have been possible if the persona had not been required and the authentic self had been more consistently welcomed. Gabor Maté says this grief is not self-pity. It is not wallowing. It is the specific biological process through which the nervous system completes what was interrupted. The emotional experience that was sealed before it could finish moving through the system. And when it is allowed to complete, when the grief is genuinely felt rather than managed into productivity or spiritual bypassing, something that has been held at great expense in a nervous system is released. And in the release, something opens, a quality of genuine presence that was not available while the unfinished grief was consuming the energy required to hold it. The fourth, begin to practice saying what is actually true for you in small situations before the large ones. The authentic self does not fully emerge in a single dramatic gesture. It emerges gradually in the accumulated small choices to express the genuine rather than the managed. To say what is actually true about what you feel, what you want, what you think, what you notice in the ordinary low-stakes moments of daily life before attempting the larger and more vulnerable expressions. Gabor Maté understood this as the gradual retraining of the nervous system. The accumulated experience of saying what is genuine and discovering that the feared consequences, the withdrawal of connection, the loss of approval, the specific dangers that the persona was built to prevent, do not always materialize. That the authentic expression, in many contexts, is received with more genuine warmth than the managed one. Because authenticity, however imperfect, has the specific quality of realness that allows genuine contact in a way that performance never quite manages. The fifth, begin to treat your own needs as legitimate rather than as burdens. The loneliness and the depression and the lostness are almost always accompanied by a specific relationship with the self's own needs, a relationship in which those needs are experienced as excessive, as burdensome, as evidence of insufficiency, as things that need to be managed and minimized rather than genuinely attended to. Gabor Maté says, the need is not the problem, the relationship with the need is the problem. The specific trained relationship in which your own needs are experienced as less legitimate than the needs of others, as things that require apology, as things that, if expressed, will confirm the wound's verdict about the fundamental excessiveness of the genuine self. Beginning to treat your own needs as legitimate, as real, as worth attending to, as deserving of the same quality of care you would offer to another person whose needs you understood and valued, is one of the most practically important and most genuinely difficult things available on the path back from the loneliness and the depression and the lostness. Because it directly addresses the specific mechanism that is producing all three. The sixth, begin to build your life around what is genuinely meaningful to you rather than around what generates approval. This is the direction question, the lostness question. And Gabor Maté was honest about how difficult it is in practice. Because the shift from external to internal direction is not a single decision. It is a gradual reorientation that happens in small choices across a long time. In the choice to spend an afternoon on what genuinely calls rather than on what is strategically optimal. In the choice to pursue a conversation that is genuinely interesting rather than one that is socially advantageous. In the accumulated small movements in the direction of what is genuinely yours. These small movements do not immediately produce the life of clear, genuine direction. But they begin to make the authentic compass more readable. They begin to distinguish the signal from the noise. And over time, with patience and with the willingness to tolerate the uncertainty of a direction that is not externally confirmed before it is internally felt, the lostness begins to resolve. Not into a fixed destination, into a genuine direction, which is all the authentic self ever needed to feel genuinely at home in its own life. The seventh, and this is the one that Gabor Maté returned to as the most important and the most foundational of all. Begin to be genuinely curious about yourself rather than judgmental about yourself. The loneliness and the depression and the lostness are sustained in significant part by a specific relationship with the self that is organized around judgment rather than curiosity, around the evaluation of whether the self is adequate, rather than the genuine inquiry into what the self is actually experiencing, around the verdict rather than a question. Gabor Maté says, the self that is perpetually being evaluated cannot be genuinely known. Because evaluation produces defense, defense produces management, and management produces the persona, the managed presentation that was built to pass the evaluation, rather than the genuine self that the evaluation was preventing from being seen. Curiosity produces something different. The genuine, non-judgmental question. What is actually happening here? What do I actually feel? What does this actually tell me about what I need? That question creates a quality of space in which the authentic self can surface without the immediate threat of the evaluative verdict, in which what is genuinely present can be noticed and named and attended to rather than immediately assessed for its adequacy. That curiosity, applied to yourself with the same quality of genuine interest and genuine non-judgment that you might apply to a person you deeply care about, is the most practical and the most powerful thing available on the path back from where you've been. Not the 40-year path, the one that begins right now, in this moment, with the willingness to be genuinely curious about what is actually present in your own experience, about what the loneliness is actually a loneliness for, about what the depression is actually suppressing, about what direction the lostness is covering. The answers are in you. They have always been in you, in the body's honest knowing, in the authentic self's patient waiting, in the genuine direction that has been present beneath the noise of the external determination all along. Gabor Maté spent 50 years helping people find their way back to those answers, not by providing them from outside, by creating the conditions, the quality of honest, compassionate, genuinely curious presence in which people could finally hear what they had always known and had been too defended or too frightened or too thoroughly trained in the management of the authentic self to trust. You do not need 50 years. You need the willingness to begin, to take the first genuine step in the direction of your own honest experience, to treat what is genuinely present in you as worth attending to rather than worth managing, to bring the quality of curiosity rather than judgment to the most important relationship available to any human being, the relationship with yourself. That relationship, entered honestly, maintained patiently, built with the same quality of genuine care that you have probably been offering to everyone else for a very long time, is what closes the loneliness, what lifts the depression at its actual source, what resolves the lostness by recovering the internal compass that the noise of the externally determined life has been drowning. Not in 20 minutes, not in a single video, but genuinely, over time, in the accumulated small choices to be more honestly present to your own genuine experience. That is the promise this video was always capable of keeping. And the privilege of a lifetime, the one that Gabor Maté pointed toward with everything he had in every book and every lecture and every hour of sitting with human beings at the full honest depth of their most unguarded experience. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not the lonely version, not the depressed version, not the lost version. Who you truly are. The one who was always there, waiting to be found by you.